over to him to chair. Nicholas is completing his PhD in theological ethics at Boston College. He is especially suited to presiding over this panel thanks to his variety of scholarly and professional expertise. As you all well know, he's been indispensable in the preparation of this symposium and to everything we've been doing at the center this year, from our fellowship program to our seminars. I'm also delighted that he will be the center's inaugural postdoctoral fellow next year. Nicholas's work examines the possibility of a politics of the common good in contemporary liberal democracies and draws on community organizing and Catholic social teaching to propose a way forward. His scholarship is informed by his 13 years as a teacher and practitioner of faith-based community organizing. He's served as a trainer with the Leading Change Network and a facilitator with the Greater Boston Interfaith Organization. His research has been published in a number of scholarly journals, and he has written for a variety of popular outlets, and I'm so pleased that he will be chairing this session. So thank you, Nicholas, and welcome to the panelists.
Thank you, Dr. Lawrence, for that very generous introduction. Good morning, everyone. My name is, again, Nicholas Hayes-Mota. I'm the assistant to the director at the Clough Center, a doctoral candidate in theological ethics, as you just heard. And my research broadly focuses on the role of religion in public life. So therefore, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you this morning to the fourth panel of our symposium, which focuses on covering religion. This morning, with the help of our four distinguished panelists, we'll bring our ongoing conversation about journalism and democracy to bear on another topic that has long been of particular interest to the Clough Center and will continue to be in the years to come, namely the relationship between religion and democracy. Now, historically speaking, religious traditions and institutions have played many roles within democratic societies. Observing the United States nearly 200 years ago, Alexis de Tocqueville maintained that religious institutions were the cornerstones of its democratic civil society, sustaining a vibrant public life and forming citizens in the habits of the heart on which the practice of democracy depends, things we heard about from Jamal Bowie on our opening night. Not infrequently, religiously inspired social movements have also been catalytic forces for social transformation, helping democracies to live up to their highest moral ideals. The Black freedom struggle in the US, which has come up several times in our symposium, being one outstanding example, but by no means the only one. Indeed, some would go so far as to argue that democracy itself, not simply as a form of government, but as a historical project, relies upon certain sacred values for its survival, values anchored in, sustained by, and passed on through religious institutions. Nevertheless, the relationship between religion and democracy can just as frequently be fraught, even mutually hostile. Within religiously pluralistic democracies like ours, some religious groups may perceive the secular state or the prevailing democratic culture itself as a threat to their way of life, sometimes with sound justification. Secular institutions may aggressively marginalize religious minorities, especially those whose beliefs or practices are perceived as incompatible with liberal democracy. And conversely, dominant religious majorities may mobilize to support illiberal forms of democracy. Conflicts between religious movements and secularizing states or among religious groups themselves may literally tear a democratic society apart. Given these complex dynamics, all of which are at play in the wider world today, and I would suggest in the US as well, how should journalists cover religion? And how do they, in fact, cover religion? How well do contemporary journalists understand the religious traditions they cover or contribute to a wider understanding of them within the publics they serve? Are journalists contributing to peaceful coexistence within religiously pluralistic societies or actively fueling polarization? And what role do journalists and journalistic institutions who engage the world from an explicitly religious perspective have to play in democratic societies? This morning, we'll hear from four distinguished panelists who will address these and other questions from a diversity of perspectives, traditions, and locations within the field of journalism. We'll hear first from Father Sam Sawyer of the Society of Jesus. Father Sawyer is the editor-in-chief of America Magazine, the Jesuit Review of Faith and Culture. At America and in other venues, Sam has written extensively on issues such as political polarization, the Catholic Church's role in a secular world, and contentious political topics such as abortion. He brings extensive experience working for and now running a religious media platform. Next, we will hear from Professor Erik Bleich, the Charles A. Dana Professor of Political Science at Middlebury College. Professor Bleich studies European and North American responses to religious, racial, and ethnic diversity through the media. In 2012, he launched the Media Portrayals of Minorities Project, and his most recent book is Covering Muslims, American Newspapers in Comparative Perspective, about which we'll be hearing some this morning. Next, we'll hear from Mark Oppenheimer, the founding director of the Yale Journalism Initiative, where he served for 15 years. Dr. Oppenheimer has been covering American religion for 25 years. From 2010 to 2016, he wrote the Beliefs column about religion for the New York Times. Now he is also the author not only of several books, but the host of Unorthodox, the world's most popular podcast about Jewish life and culture. Last but certainly not least, we'll hear from Kathryn Jean Lopez. Kathryn Jean Lopez is a senior fellow at the National Review Institute, where she directs the Center for Religion, Culture, and Civil Society. She is also editor-at-large of National Review magazine, where she has been on the editorial staff for over a quarter century. She has published widely in Catholic and secular publications, and is also a nationally syndicated columnist with Andrews McMeel Universal. I'm sure our panelists will have many reflections to share on the questions we've been exploring already and some of the new questions pertaining to this topic. So with that, let me welcome our first speaker, Father Sam Sawyer. Please come up.
Thank you to Nicholas and my fellow panelists. If I can be permitted a moment of personal reflection, I did my undergrad here at BC, so I'm home at Alma Mater. And when I was here 25 years ago, this room was the honors library, so study space, but also a seminar room for the honors program, 2-year-long great books, core curriculum, double credit. So for 2 years of my life, I sat over there for about 8 hours a week. And it's one of the places where I learned to think. But also, this room is one of the places where I learned both the deep compatibility and the deep necessity of intellectual and spiritual depth going hand in hand. So it is wonderful to be back and to be with you. What I'm going to do today in my remarks is drawn from actually sort of a big vision essay that by sheer happenstance and good luck just went live on our site yesterday and will roll out more fully next week. The title there is Catholicism, Authentic Communion, and the Way Out of Our Polarization Trap. But me setting out a vision for America Magazine as I've just started as editor-in-chief. I took office on December 1st. So what I want to do is unpack a little bit a framework for understanding some of the narrative ways that we talk about religion with respect to secularity, and then talk about the implications that might have for the way religion and democracy interact. So the framework I'm using here, and let's see if we can get to the next slide, is drawn from Charles Taylor, the set of distinctions he makes at the beginning of his mega tome called A Secular Age. 900 pages long. I am compressing this part of it to a single slide, so bear with me here. First he says, sometimes we use the word secular, this is particularly the old version of it, to distinguish a sphere that's differentiated from the sacred. So the spiritual versus the temporal, realms of authority that are not overlapping, but are certainly related to each other, that interact. There's also a sense of secular as the result of a process of secularization. So think enlightened here, the exclusion of religion from some aspects of the public sphere, its relegation to a private space, the idea that religion and religious belief is necessarily in decline with respect to rationality. So this I'm going to call secularism as a sort of ideological opposition to religion, or at least antagonism with respect to it, a model of tension. But Taylor is not convinced about the secularization thesis, that secularization is inevitable and progressive and will always happen. And so what he wants to call our attention to is his third sense of secular, which is a context, a cultural context in which belief is optional and no longer the default option. And so diagrammatically, it's not the best diagram in the world, but secularity is in the background, and anyone who is religious within the context of secularity. But so too anyone who's non-religious is non-religious within the context of secularity. So it was very quick, but if we've got that basic framework, here's how I think it applies. And I also want to offer the caveat that this is a story told basically within the history of Western Christianity, and my particular expertise, a practitioner's rather than a scholar's expertise, is within Catholicism specifically. So this may not apply so well globally or in other religious spheres, but I think it's still useful to think about regardless. So we've got these two narrative frameworks, either religion and secularism in antagonistic tension with each other, or a context of secularity which complicates the experience of both religion, both belief and non-belief. And often the question is, which narrative framework are journalists going to use to tell stories about religion, and to tell stories about religion where it comes into contact and sometimes tension with democratic practice? And here I want to suggest that one of the drivers of polarization is a breakdown in our efforts at pluralism, in our efforts to live together with people who have very different and often non-overlapping visions of the common good and of fundamental structures of meaning and responsibility. Taylor calls that experience cross-pressure, the experience of having all these multiple options that are live for us at any given time. A good illustration of this is if you although it's more private, if you think about an experience you have in prayer that feels to you like the voice of God, but then at the same time you're also saying to yourself, or maybe I'm just talking to myself. That's Taylor's cross-pressure. I'm arguing that this also exists at a social level, and one of the things it does to us is it makes us feel like our fundamental commitments, because they can't be secured by default, are always under threat and somewhat tentative. And so we often wind up looking for enemies to project that threat onto, or enemies who are actually projecting that threat onto us, and that drives the engine of polarization. But it also means that the narrative frames we use to talk about this can drive the engine of polarization. So I want to offer a couple ideas about how defaulting to this narrow secularism frame, which is easier to write about, easier to talk about, easier to name, can help exacerbate polarization. A couple simple mechanisms for that. First, I think that drawing the story this way can exacerbate the feeling, particularly among people who understand themselves as the religious masses and not the elites, right? It can reinforce a sense of elite disregard for and antagonism to religion that can then itself be open to exploitation by sort of polarization entrepreneurs, both secular partisan forces who want to lay claim to a religious a religious base that's going to drive their political movement, but also actors within religion itself who think of themselves and maybe even have some kind of honest experience of themselves as standing up nobly for the truth against a hostile world, right? But every time that stories are told in this exclusive secularism frame, that helps that narrative gain velocity and gain inertia. Are there better outcomes to hope for? And here I want to suggest that one of the things that would be helpful in journalism, I think both because it's ultimately a richer, less boring, more accurate version of the real world and the stories we want to tell, but also because it's a narrative that's somewhat less vulnerable to exploitation, is this secularity narrative, where we're talking about the complexities of belief in the contemporary context of secularity. And so here I want to identify both that there, as much as there are folks in religion, and I've in conversation over the last day, I've had a lot of people ask me both about Catholics in the integralism movement, so Catholics who are making an explicitly non-liberal argument against democracy, but we've also talked about Christian nationalism as well. Certainly those forces exist within religious spaces, they're real. But there are also people within religious institutions, people who are religious themselves. I would like to point here to Mustafa Akyol's discussion yesterday about Islamic liberalism, there are people in religion trying explicitly to live in this secularity framework, to narrate their own experience that way, to understand how religion functions well as part of a pluralistic framework and can be not only compatible with democracy, but also a source of energy for it and for how we live together. So, as I'm wrapping up here, I think there's also a hope in that if we can start to tell more stories that recognize the secularity framework alongside and sometimes in contrast to the secularism framework. There's also a hope for how we understand religion as more than just an individual and epistemic commitment, right? So particularly in Catholicism, we understand ourselves as in a communion, as being bound together by something more profound than simply our own agreement. It's not just a social contract. And I think that there are a lot of ways in parallel, not identical, but there are a lot of ways in which democracy depends on some sense that we are bound together by something more than just our own agreement. And that if we are better able to recognize the way that works in the religious experience and religious lives of the people we're telling stories about, we might also have better chances to see it and support it in democracies as well. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you to Jonathan and Nicholas and the Clough Center for inviting me and for organizing these amazing 2.5 days of panels. It's been a real treat and a pleasure. I'm going to talk to you from a more scholarly perspective than from a journalist perspective. My colleague Maurits van der Veen and I just finished this book last year where we looked at media coverage of Muslims, primarily in the American newspaper market, also in some other countries, so I'm going to focus mostly today on the US. And you may be wondering what the bottom line is, and the bottom line is something you probably already know, because it's well established in the existing literature that Muslims tend to be negatively portrayed in the media. So that is not a new observation that I'm making today. However, what I want to suggest is we actually don't know as much as we think we know about just how negatively they're portrayed and in what ways. And that's because most of the existing literature on Muslim portrayals in the media don't actually compare portrayals of Muslims to essentially the average news story. If the average news story is negative and portrayals of Muslims are negative, are portrayals of Muslims just simply negative because they're like the average news story? Another question is, are portrayals of Muslims any more negative than portrayals of any other religious, racial, ethnic group? Maybe those groups only come into the media's eye when there's some form of conflict. So these are the questions I think that, that are not yet quite known. And so my colleague and I gathered some data to try to answer this question. I'm a political scientist. He's a political scientist with a background in computer science. And we basically assembled all articles mentioning Islam or Muslims or variations on those terms for an extensive period of time, which I'll talk about in a second. And just want to tell you our shorthand for these articles are the Muslim articles. We also selected the same types of articles for comparison groups, Catholic, Jewish, Hindu articles, atheist, Mormon, African American, Latino articles, to be able to try to understand how articles about Muslims compare to articles that touch on these other groups. So these are the new, we looked at 17 national and regional newspapers, 21-year period, from January 1st, 96 to December 31st, 2016. That's 256,963 articles. And yes, that's a lot of articles. It's as many as it sounds. And we have over 1 million articles across all groups. It's a painstaking effort to actually gather all of these articles. In my spare time yesterday in the break, I actually downloaded about 2,500 articles from the Telegraph, just because you got to keep the ball rolling. This is our lives. I like to joke that my friend's ideal version of a Saturday night is a glass of red wine and 20,000 downloads. Okay, so how do we analyze them? We take all of the words in these articles and we match them to dictionaries, 8 separate dictionaries of positive and negative words. And these are dictionaries that have been validated in a variety of ways. And essentially what you get a sense of at the end of the day is how many negative words are in an article and how many positive words, and how on average positive or negative, therefore, is that article. So you can see not only whether an article is positive or negative, but how positive or negative an article is. And I'm going to throw some numbers up here. You don't have to understand all of the details behind them, but I want you to get a sense of what they mean. So we basically scale all of our articles against a sample of over 48,000 US articles from the same newspaper. What's positive, what's negative, in our view, is relative to the average news story in the American newspaper market. And so this gives us a sense of what the average news story sounds like. So an article with a score of 0 has the same tone as the average newspaper article in our random sample. And you've got a little view of a bell curve there, because what I want you to see is that an article with a score of -1 is more negative than about 85% of all of these articles. So the score of -1 means 34% are negative, but more positive than -1, plus 50% that are positive. So that's roughly what this means. We rescale so that we can use this as a standard metric. And less formally, I want to just point out that we look at lots of different groups of articles, and if the average of a group of articles on a particular country, we did research on Africa, we've done research on individual groups, if the average article is essentially in the middle, we think of it as essentially neutral. And anything more negative than -0.5 is strongly negative. There are very few cases of articles about Iran, Africa, any country, any group that you can think of, where the average article is more negative than -0.5. Okay, so how negative are Muslim articles? Are they a little more negative than the average article, a lot more negative? The answer is they're a lot more negative, right? The average tone of Muslim articles is -0.94. And that means that the average article that mentions the words Muslim or Islam is more negative than 84% of the articles in our representative sample. You'd have to read a lot of articles about random topics to get an article that's as negative as the average Muslim article. What does this sound like? Right? I think it's probably helpful to have a little more of an intuitive sense. So this is a sentence with a tone of 0. Muslim cleric from the U.S. Navy will arrive today to discuss religious issues. Very anodyne, sounds neutral. It is neutral. This is what an article sounds like with a tone of -0.94. The Russian was made to believe by undercover agents that the radioactive material was to be delivered to a Muslim organization. So there's no mistaking the difference. There's no mistaking the negativity in an article that has a tone of -0.94. Okay, how does this compare to the average article score for articles mentioning Catholics, Jews, and Hindus? Maybe they're all quite as negative. There are a lot of stressful negative stories about these groups, that's for sure. But the average is very different. Right? So Catholic articles, Jewish articles in that essentially neutral zone. Hindu articles, modestly, marginally negative. And if you want a visualization of this, this is the way to look at it. This is very different. This curve for Muslim articles is very different than the curve for really any other group. And the area under the curve represents the percentage of articles that are positive. This is 20% of the curve. In other words, only 20% of articles touching on Muslims are positive, 80% are negative. There's a lot of negativity no matter how you look at it. Then we thought, well, what if the articles that are negative are really just about foreign locations? What if we just strip down all the articles to just the ones that mention Muslim Americans or that are set uniquely in the United States? And the answer is, okay, I get the answer in a second. Who do we compare them to? In this case, we said, let's compare articles touching on Muslim Americans to those touching on disadvantaged U.S. racial and ethnic groups, and to the most unpopular by survey standards, religious categories, religious in quotes because Mormons and atheists, a non-religious group. And whoops, the answer is, there it is. The answer is, it's better. Articles about Muslim Americans are less negative, but they're still very negative. They're still on the borderline of strongly negative, but still very much more negative than articles about these other groups. So again, it's not that you strip away all articles about foreign stories and the articles get normal. They don't. They're still quite negative. Okay. Where do we go from here? What are the lessons we take away? I'm not quite sure why this is jumping forward so much. We want to shift the focus from Muslims, which are often seen and debated as sort of the problematic group. Are they a problematic group? What's the problem? To the media. And we suggest that we want to think through the lens of systemic Islamophobia. Right? Systemic Islamophobia doesn't mean that there are bad actors out there that are trying to stigmatize Muslims. We actually think that conscious stigmatization by journalists is rare, but there is a kind of common use of stock stories and stock phrases in stories or words that keep come up. Not all Muslims are terrorists, but, right, or something along those lines. Terrorism happens to be a word that pops up very frequently in stories about Muslims. So these stories tend to reinforce boundaries around Muslims, even when they might be stories that are trying to be sort of progressive. Finally, we suggest that both the media and citizens engage in what we call tone checking. Tone checking is an analog to fact checking, and we think journalists can do this. Editors can reflect on the stories they assign, reporters can reflect on the words that they use in those stories, and media organizations can hire tone checkers, right, to find out what are, like, let's do a review. What have the stories about particular groups been like in our newspaper over time? Are we subconsciously using some tropes that we might want to consciously erase from our dictionaries? We also think that citizens can engage in tone checking. So my hope is that now that you know something about the data and know something about systemic Islamophobia, you're going to read the newspaper, you're going to listen to stories with a bit of a more skeptical eye, and you will do some of the work yourself, we hope others will too, to consciously offset the negativity that's deeply embedded in the American media landscape about Muslims. Thank you.
This is great. Thank you all for coming out. Thanks to my fellow panelists. Really great to be here. And I'm learning a lot. And it's good for me to be back at Boston College. I taught here for a year, about 8 years ago, at the Center for Christian-Jewish Relations and the Corcoran Center. It's just great. It's a great school, wonderful place. Okay, so I have been, I've sort of been in between academia and journalism for 25 years. Sometimes I think of myself as a refugee from academia, sometimes a squatter there. But I'm going to talk today from the lens of somebody who's a working journalist and also a reader. I know that we all, probably one thing we all have in common here, whatever our vocation or avocation is reading and consuming stories for the popular media about explaining to us lots of things, but inter alia, religion groups, including religion groups that aren't our own. I want to just start, and this actually gets so close to what you were just said to the presentation we just heard about tone checking. So it's nice to see the synergy here. I want to start with, this is from May 14th, 2019. So depths of COVID, and the New York Times ran a story, and we'll read it to you. So this is the head and the subhead. They sent a reporter to a big conference up in Muncie, New York, which is has a lot of highly observant Jews. Some would say ultra-Orthodox. Some ultra-Orthodox Jews, by the way, think that the term ultra-Orthodox is negative because it's never good to be ultra anything. It's kind of saying fundamentalist. So they would prefer traditional or highly observant. They would say Torah Jews. Anyway, we'll cut down to this is pulled from the middle of the article. The event was held in a large ballroom. As is customary at ultra-Orthodox gatherings, the men were separated by an improvised wall from the women. Speakers were introduced and applauded as if they were celebrities. Okay, so it was a big conference about vaccines that included some vaccine skepticism. And one paragraph says they were separated by sex, which would not be surprising in a room filled with highly observant Orthodox Jews. An article ran in The Independent that was identical in every respect, except it said, the event was held in a large ballroom. As is customary at ultra-Orthodox gatherings, the men were separated by an improvised wall from the women, many of whom were visibly pregnant. Speakers were introduced and applauded as if they were celebrities. Okay, so what do we think happened here? Why do they read, and by the way, the articles are otherwise 100% identical, the same article, except one of them says, many of whom describes the women by their gestational status, which I take to be an act of pretty naked misogyny, because we don't go around describing men by their gestational status. It's not relevant to the article really in any way. The article doesn't make the case that it's relevant somehow, as if incubating babies is a vaccine concern. One could imagine an article making that case, but it doesn't. It just describes them as, these are women, many of them knocked up, basically. What happened? Why did The Independent, the British newspaper, in its website run the same article, but with many of whom were visibly pregnant? Does anyone have a theory on that?
Yeah, the Times originally had that.
That's right.
And Independent.
Bingo. The Times story, when I read it at 11:17 p.m. or whatever on May 14th, said, the Times reporter wrote, separated by an improvised wall from the women, comma, many of whom were visibly pregnant. And then the Times deleted that within a few minutes. You can't find it on the Times website. But The Independent in England, which had picked up the article, presumably through a syndication service, kept it. So that's how you can find, when I went looking to prove that the Times had originally done this, the only way I could prove it, because the Times didn't run a correction or say that an original version stated that the women were visibly pregnant, and then we deleted it because we realized that was an act of rank misogyny, and as well as sort of ostracism, othering, orientalization of Orthodox Jews, because they probably don't go around describing Congregationalists or Lutherans by their gestational status as much as they do ultra-Orthodox women, who are more likely to have 8 or 10 or 12 children, right? The only way I could show that the original article did that was that a version of it picked up by a British website never got the memo that they aren't supposed to include that phrase. If people are interested in the Q&A, I can take you down the rabbit hole of my correspondence with the editors, trying to figure out why this happened. But what I want to say is that it is interesting to me, if you want an example of unintentional, well-meaning, but nonetheless biased bias in the mainstream media, it would be this particular treatment of ultra-Orthodox Jewish women. And I'm quite certain that people in this audience have come across similar treatments of the gestational status of traditional Catholic women, of Latter-day Saint women, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I would say here the tone is actually fairly neutral. It's not derisive. But the mere inclusion of those words struck me as contemptible. So what I want to say here is, in terms of religion and democracy, is that I absolutely think there is a preference on the part of journalists. I include myself here. I think I have unconscious biases. What I would say is I think that we have preferences and biases. That is unquestionably the case. And contrary to those who would say, therefore, we must sort of give in to them and accept that all media are biased and we should go back to the partisan press and accept that's the way, I would say it's actually quite incumbent on us to fight these. One of the biases that I think we have to fight, and here I don't know if I'm in favor of the Guild of Professional Tone Checkers. That sounds Orwellian and scary to me, but we can talk about that. We can talk about who would qualify. I'm not trying to make fun. I'm really intrigued and provoked by the idea in a good way. I'm wondering who would be a tone checker. But certainly as journalists, I like the idea that we as journalists have to be tone checkers ourselves, and I like the idea that our readers can discount for, as tone checkers themselves, can discount for the biases that journalists might hold. I think that one of our biases is toward what we see as democracy. And obviously that plays out at the sort of macro statist level when we think that, as many journalists have, that certain politicians are threatening to both journalism and democracy in the same ways, right? So many journalists believed, and I shared some of this belief myself, that Donald Trump's contempt for the media was undermining both of democracy and of journalism. I very much believed that. I still do to some extent. It's unclear if the same Guild of Journalists was as pro-democracy when covering the American invasion of Iraq, a far less democratic country than America, and a country that today is more democratic by a bit than it was under Saddam Hussein, right? So one could imagine that the pro-democracy bent, whatever that is, would be pro-invasion in that sense. I'm not sure, you follow what I'm saying here, that even democracy is not a neutral category. It'll affect, if we think of ourselves as pro-democracy, it will have different valences depending on what we're covering. I think when we go to cover religion, one of the things that happens is that many journalists, and the journalism world is an overwhelmingly secular and secularized one, have a bias against religions that they see as inherently anti-democratic within their own domuses, right? So one of the things that happens when a New York Times journalist, and it could be a journalist from any number of papers, goes to cover in a highly Haredi, ultra-Orthodox town, a convention of Haredi, traditional, ultra-Orthodox, whatever you want to say, Jews, is that the bias is, I'm going to a space that is anti-democratic, highly patriarchal, deeply other to me, And one of my jobs then is to point out ways in which certain people might be oppressed within their own community. In other words, to bring my pro-freedom, liberatory, democracy lens to writing about this community. I think journalists are a little more likely to do that when covering Haredi Jews than when covering, say, the Amish, who are equally anti-democratic in their internal structure, but are well beloved of liberal secular journalists for their folksy ways. But nevertheless, right? And I think that one of the things that happens is you get a skew of coverage toward religious movements that seem potentially liberatory, toward political figures within those religious figures who are seen as politically amenable to a sort of secular democratic process. So Pope Francis, more beloved than other recent popes for this reason, seen as part of a democratic project. And what I would say, by the way, is not necessarily that any of these claims or biases in specific is wrong. What I would say is that as a general outlook, it is one, the pro-democracy bias, which by the way is one that I certainly share. I don't want to live in any countries that aren't, if not democracies, at least sort of small r republics. I want the voters to be able to weigh in, if not on every decision by plebiscite, at least every 2 or 4 years. That is certainly how I was raised, and it's a bias as I'm an American, and it's deep, deep, deep in my core. But as journalists, I don't think we should set out to be working for democracy. The job is to set out to tell true stories and to make them accessible to a wide audience of people who are doing other things, who have other vocations. The job is to say, I'm privileged enough to get paid to go cover this story in Muncie, New York, or Baghdad, or Tehran, or London, or Caracas, and I have to report the story back to people who, with a little bit of money or a little bit of attention, are paying a currency to learn the story because their daily job is dental hygienist or plumber or elementary school teacher or whatever. That's a very, very sacred trust, I think, between the journalist and the reader. And the second that we commit to weighing in on the side of any particular political order, religious order, or intrinsic construction of a particular community, the second that we go in to rescue the members of the ultra-Orthodox town of Muncie from their own anti-democratic structures, we're going to fail. But what we will succeed in doing is probably doing some sort of, I hate the word violence when not used toward physical violence, but doing somehow wronging them in our construal of their world. And that is something that I think journalists very much have to guard against. Thank you.
Good morning. Happy St. Patrick's Day.
Thank you.
If you will bear with me for a moment, and this is related to what I want to say, I'm going to read the Lorica of St. Patrick. And if you're a Christian and you want to pray along, please feel free. I arise today through a mighty strength, the invocation of the Trinity, through a belief in the threeness, through confession of the oneness, of the creator of creation. I arise today through the strength of Christ's birth and his baptism, through the strength of his crucifixion and his burial, through the strength of his resurrection and his ascension, through the strength of his descent for the judgment of doom. I arise today through the strength of the love of cherubim, in obedience of angels, in service of archangels, in the hope of resurrection to meet with reward, in the prayers of patriarchs, in preachings of the apostles, in faiths of confessors. I arise today through the strength of heaven, light of the sun, splendor of fire, speed of lightning, swiftness of the wind, depth of the sea, stability of the earth, firmness of the rock. I rise today through God's strength to pilot me, God's might to uphold me, God's wisdom to guide me, God's eye to look before me, God's ear to hear me, God's word to speak for me, God's hand to guard me, God's way to lie before me, God's shield to protect me, God's host to save me from the snares of the devil, from the temptations of vices, from everyone who desires me ill, afar and near, alone or in multitude. I summon today all these powers between me and evil, against every cruel, merciless power that opposes my body and soul, against false laws of heretics, against craft of idolatry, against spells of women and smiths and wizards, against every knowledge that corrupts man's body and soul. Christ, shield me today against poison, against burning, against drowning, against wounding, so that reward may come to me in abundance. Christ with me, Christ before me, Christ behind me, Christ in me, Christ beneath me, Christ above me, Christ on my right, Christ on my left, Christ when I lie down, Christ when I sit, Christ in the heart of every man who thinks of me, Christ in the mouth of every man who speaks of me, Christ in the eye that sees me, Christ in the ear that hears me. I arise today through a mighty strength, the invocation of the Trinity, through belief in the threeness, through confession of the oneness of the creator of creation. And thank you for bearing with me. We're at a Catholic university. I thought that might be appropriate on St. Patrick's Day. And the reason I wanted to start that way too is because what I wanted to say is first of all, I hesitated a little bit to take this invitation. This is the second time, I'm humbled by the invitation, but this is the second time in a week that I've been talking about the media. And I don't like to talk about the media. And part of that is because since I was in my 20s, I've worked at a conservative outlet. And first of all, I apologize for not getting here yesterday, but I listened to some of the presentations, and I heard the founder of National Review, William F. Buckley, described as a far-right conservative. And I think he was a little more mainstream than that. And it can be a little bit of a conservative parlor game to complain about the media. Oh, the liberal media. Yeah, okay. People have biases, that's fine. And one of I also heard someone describe, and I don't know fully what it was intended, but so-called opinion journalists. I am really grateful for opinion journalism. That's what I do. And I do think there's something to be said for having your biases on the table. You know, anyone who reads me knows where I'm coming from. I'm reading the breastplate of St. Patrick. You know, that's my worldview, and I think there's something to be said for that, because I think not only do you, I think, have a certain respect, and I should preface this by saying, I have all the respect in the world for the atheist who covers religious groups fairly and does their homework. But I also think there's something to be said for the reverence that comes from being a fellow believer, whether, you know, whatever it is that you believe, just understanding that religion is fundamental and does, you know, is transformational, and having a sense of the transcendent. It adds something to life. If you understand that, I think that it leads to a different way that you cover journalism. I think too, and Jonathan mentioned Alexis de Tocqueville, you want your neighbors to be believers. You know, everyone doesn't have to be a believer, but a number of years ago, I was at a dinner with Robert Putnam. Pope Francis was just mentioned. It was early on in his pontificate, so about 10 years ago. And Putnam knew I was Catholic, and he said, I hope you don't mind if I speak frankly. And of course, I want people to speak frankly. And he said, Pope Francis seems to believe what the gospel says. You know, at the time we were seeing pictures of him embracing people with disabilities and all of that. And of course, the conservative in me would say, well, Pope Benedict embraced children and people too. He loved babies. But there was a huge opportunity, I thought, that came with Pope Francis. And that was that people were taking a second look. But what Putnam said to me was, Jesus was pretty, and he's a secular Jew. He said, Jesus was pretty clear on the Sermon on the Mount and the Beatitudes, what Christians are supposed to do. If Christians were actually living that, our country would be a lot different. Amen. Amen. And that's part of the reason I think that having a religious perspective in the media is helpful, because we can challenge, you know? We can be a check. We're not coming from a foreign perspective, you know? So rather than complain about the liberal media, I decided years ago, I'm going to encourage parents to encourage their kids to work for the New York Times, to work for CNN, not to complain, to be a part of the solution. Years ago, and this is the far right world that I come from, I'm sorry. Gary Sinise the actor, has this community, what is it called? Friends of Abraham Lincoln. And this probably, I don't know, this was 15 years ago or so. I happened to be in California, and I went to one of these gatherings. And it was like the head of Dole Foods, his huge estate. And there are all of these actors who I sort of like vaguely recognized from, a character actor on CSI or whatever the show would be. And they would say, I read Jonah Goldberg all the time. They would quote to me Thomas Sowell. They would say, you saved my life on the election day in 2000. I just kept reading you on National Review. All these conservatives, and the point why I bring that up is because if you're a screenwriter for Grey's Anatomy, that's a different kind of media. You can tell a story that's maybe a little more traditional, maybe a little more nuanced about something contentious like abortion. If you are working for the New York Times, your vantage point will be different, and you may cover stories. You're going to cover congressional races and everything else, but there are opportunities. And one of the things in particular, and I think this is good for everyone, this is not necessarily an apologetics, but I remember being in Rome when, it was 10 years ago, when Pope Francis the conclave was happening, and it was the night before Pope Francis was elected. I'm just watching my time before Jonathan cuts me off. And it was the night before he was elected, and I was on Piers Morgan on CNN, and the first question he asked me was about some settlement that had happened in California, in Los Angeles that day. I had no idea what was going on in Los Angeles because I was in St. Peter's Square. And so I said to him, I'm really sorry, I don't know what's going on. And then I talked to him about what was going on and what the energy was in Rome. And of course, you can't report that much because the cardinals aren't supposed to say anything to you. But you can talk about what faithful Catholics were talking about and feeling. And the media can be such an opportunity for religion. And I think that is a benefit to culture, to democracy. For so many people tell me, and I generally feel like a crazy person talking like this, in secular venues, but people will say to me, thank you, I found that helpful. We're not talking about angry things. You don't seem like you hate non-Christians. The number of times that have been said to me really makes me sad. But it also makes me want to encourage more and more for Christians to be in the public square, whether it's in media, whether it's in politics, whether it's in entertainment, and be bold and be loving. And I think we can all benefit from that. So thank you.
Thank you all for really rich and provocative presentations. I just want to ask a couple questions before turning things over to the audience, who I'm sure will have some themselves. I think the first concerns the idea of objectivity, which has been an ongoing thread in some of our discussions in this symposium. Whether it remains a valid ideal for journalism, whether it really was historically speaking, a dominant ideal for journalism? And if no longer objectivity, what maybe should step into its place? And in various ways, I hear your presentations challenging journalists about whether their coverage of religion has been objective, or whether even it's possible to be objective, or it should be objective. And so I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that, both about the ideal of objectivity itself, but also about how you think attention to religion as a topic to be covered, or one's own perspective as a religious journalist, might inflect your understanding of that ideal, its possibility, or what might be better put in its place.
Do you want to pick one of us to start? Or?
Sam, it looks like you're ready to start.
Yesterday, I think it was Barbie in her panel discussion, or maybe it was in a question she asked later, but she talked about, even while questioning objectivity and the elevated value assigned to it in journalistic ethics, the necessity to make sure that reality got a vote, so to speak. That reality and facts on the ground, admitting that facts are also subject to construction and interpretation, but that facts on the ground actually be evaluated. And so I think that part of objectivity, certainly we have to find a way to get to that. But as I tried to indicate in my remarks, I think the situatedness of where we're looking at things from determines a lot of what objectivity looks like, right? So if you are speaking within a frame where religious commitments are purely in one's head and don't have some kind of transcendent substantive reality, then you tell different stories than if you're in the frame where those religious commitments are real and in the world, even though not visible. So what do we do about that? One suggestion I would make, and I don't know how to translate this into secular language, but I think one of the most important things in the experience of Christian conversion is the practice of, let me call it, hopeful self-accusation, right? So St. Paul's sinners of whom I am the greatest. And you start to be attentive to your own need for correction and desirous of correction, right? And that practice of correctability, which is much richer than just sort of like a positivistic sort of falsifiability of facts. But that practice of self-correctability, I think, is one of the ways that we aspire to an objectivity that's rich and not just formulaic.
Thank you. Anyone else like to jump in?
I just want to underscore that. I mean, Twitter, where a lot of journalists interact with one another, is the opposite of humility, right? There's this constant, insinuation that you know best, we can't have good journalism and good politics without humility and gratitude too. I mean, one of the things that I'm super grateful for is that at National Review, which Bill Buckley founded, Bill was really about gratitude. He was a smart dude, but he didn't think he was the smartest guy who ever walked in the room. He always talked about the patrimony and, being good stewards of what has come before. And I do worry, especially, I hate to talk about the young people and how they don't understand, but they don't. There's this. I was at my alma mater a day ago, Catholic University in Washington, and I was talking to the college Republicans, and I had to start by saying I'm not sure if I'm a registered Republican anymore or not. I actually am, because I'm lazy, and so didn't change my registration. But Ed Gillespie went to Catholic University, and they were saying they have a hard time with speakers, and I said, well, why don't you call Ed Gillespie, who was the head of the RNC and the governor of Virginia? And they said, could you spell that name for me? No knowledge of what has come before. I mean, that's a little tiny example. That's not Shakespeare, but yeah, we have to have humility and gratitude.
I'll just say, I love that story. I mean, one of the things, because it points to something else, which is the current, every moment has its own sort of know-nothingism. Every moment has its own blind spots. The current blind spot, beyond all the other isms, is ageism. That one thing that young progressives and young conservatives agree on is let's book a speaker who's under 35.
Yeah.
And if you point out that actually the most interesting speakers will be 60 or over, people forget, for example, that it's illegal to say we want to go out and hire a great young person for this job. It is as illegal to say that as it is to say we want to hire a great white person or a great straight person. It is 1964 Civil Rights Act. You can't hire based on it, but people do it all the time. And so, yes, I mean, we are in a very weird moment on left and right where the sense is that all wisdom resides in people under 30. And so people will say, I can't find a good speaker. So that's but to the bigger question, I'm just so glad you brought that up. To the bigger question of objectivity, I'm going to say something that is putting myself down as much as it's putting anyone down, because it was initially directed as a critique at me. I was sitting in synagogue, and I made some sort of comment about, I don't know, I didn't like something in the prayer book or some language here or whatever. And the woman sitting next to me, and this has become my mantra, she's an oncologist. She's pregnant with twins. She'll have 4 children and be a full-time oncologist. She's a genius. She's a good mom. She's one of these people I really kind of revere. And she looked at me and said, Mark, aren't we all grown-ups here? And her point, I just think of that all. I was upset about something in the prayer book that either was too right-wing or too left-wing or something. She's like, aren't we all grown-ups here? Can't you just let your eyes skim past it and pray anyway and be in community with all these people and not get hung up on that because you're a grown man with a family and a job and you pay your taxes? And why are you getting hung up on this the way that your 7-year-old would get hung up on this, right? You said something unfair to me. And that's sort of the way I feel about the objectivity debate is, aren't we all grown-ups here? Don't we know that obviously there's no alternative to some practice of objectivity, that we can't write in, even in sort of magazines with a Catholic heritage and a conservative point of view, or in a Jewish publication like some of the ones I've worked for, we don't say stuff, when the Red Sea's parted, as if everyone acknowledges that that's historically true, that if we say it, we sort of say, as Jews believe, or as the Hebrew Bible teaches, or that there's always a kind of understanding that we're writing for different audiences, even when we're writing for a Catholic or Jewish or Mormon publication, and we account for that. And similarly, when we go writing, shouldn't we always try to stay in the fact-based community? I find these arguments to my mind, where it comes down to, and I think everyone, and Sam, you said this very beautifully, is if you are yourself grounded in your private life or in your off time, in your downtime, when you're not on the job, in a faith community, if you're religious, if you go to synagogue twice a week, as I do, you will tell different stories because you'll know about some stories that your totally secular friends don't know about. Bottom line, I simply know of stuff going on in the Jewish world because I hear water cooler talk after services on Saturday that most people at the New York Times or the Washington Post, or certainly National Review, not being at the water cooler at synagogue, never hear. Point 2, I have different sources. Not always better, but bigger Rolodex. You have a bigger Catholic Rolodex than I do. So do you. With lots of work and having been in this field a long time, I'm pretty good. You guys are 20% better on your Catholic Rolodex. But as far as Jews go, as far as non-Catholics go, pretty darn good. But I have no Rolodex when it comes to, the Pentecostal community, whatever I had as atrophied. So obviously you want people on staff who have a whole host of experiences, including being in religious communities, because they will know about stories and they will know about people to talk to that go beyond the typical self-promoting media faces who always want to be quoted. But by the way, sorry, then I'll shut up. By the way, that quest for diversity in newsrooms should go beyond religion. It should go beyond race. It should go beyond, one of the problems with the Times is they all live in greater New York. I mean, the difference between New York, they don't all, they have lots of bureaus. I understand that. But the difference between the perspective of people who live in kind of New York, Westchester, Long Island, and me 80 miles away in Connecticut, my friends on my street have no idea about Twitter battles. They live in a different world. And if you went up to northern Maine, they live in a different world still. And we should be having more people who went to non-Ivy League schools on staff, more people without college degrees, which used to be okay in journalism, more veterans. But don't we know that as grown-ups? I just feel like that's obvious. But I forget it sometimes. So glad Laura told me.
Can I just say the point about real America is so important, because I would extend it, the Acela corridor. We need people who are not in the Acela corridor, as much as I love the Acela, because I go between DC and New York a lot. But like in a Catholic context, for example, I was speaking at a conference that EWTN and Franciscan University were doing on the media the other day, and somebody at the coffee break says, like, oh my goodness, Germany, like the German bishops. And my mother has no idea what the German bishops are doing. She goes to daily mass. My sister is a Catholic school principal. She has no idea about the German bishops. Like, sometimes we really need a reality check about what is really affecting people and what people know about and need to know about, honestly.
Erik, would you like to wrap this up?
Yeah, thanks. First of all, I just want to point out that nobody under 35 knows what a Rolodex is.
Good point.
They can look it up in their paper dictionary.
I think I want to tie this question to something I've been thinking about over the last couple of days, which is about authenticity, right? And I don't think that word has come up in our conference so far, but I started thinking about it actually, Riata, when you were talking, and it's been a thread through a lot of the discussions of you can tell more, better stories if you are authentically part of a community as opposed to parachuting in from the outside. But I think it's not a perfect contrast to that, but I think Ron Suskind, yesterday was like, I can parachute in from the outside and talk about movies, and all of a sudden I'm going to get great stories that you might not. That's oversimplifying his argument, but there's a tension there between saying the people from the community can get better stories, and people from the community might be biased in the way they get their stories, right? So I think that is a very difficult thing to sort through. I am not a Muslim. I don't practice any faith. I wrote a book on portrayals of Muslims in the media. Does that make me more objective? Does that make me more trustworthy? Or does it make me less trustworthy because I'm looking at the data and not reading the stories through the eyes of a practitioner of the faith? So I think about this in my own work, but I don't know the solution, right? I think the solution is whether you're a person from a community or not, you're going to maybe have a slightly different take on the story or what's interesting, and that's important to recognize. But I do think that no matter where you're coming from, you can do a better or worse job of trying to get more facts, trying to understand people better or worse. So I think tying the objectivity question to authenticity is something that I'm mulling over, and I wonder if other people are as well.
Thank you for that. And I just want to name a connection. A similar debate has been live in community organizing for as long as the field has existed. The founder of the organizing tradition within which I work, Saul Alinsky, was a non-professing Jew who first organized among ethnic Catholics in Chicago. And he maintained that only an outsider could really bring the perspective needed to see what was going on in the community and to begin disorganizing and reorganizing it. And he did. But of course, in organizing, having what he called native leaders from the community to actually take up the project and do it themselves, because of the understanding they bring that an outsider can't, is also important. And there's often a tension between those roles. I wonder if something similar exists in the field of journalism. With that, we're running out of time, and I suspect there are questions in the audience. So if we could have our mic runner, awesome. Mustafa, please.
Thank you so much. This was a stellar panel, and I learned a lot. A question to Father Sawyer. I love your distinction between secularism and secularity, and how religion and secularity can interact with each other. To make that work, which is being challenged, right? Is it true that we need secularity not to be ideological and that don't have metaphysical? It shouldn't be the metaphysical assumptions of atheism that becomes secularity, right? So there should be a humbleness there. But from the religious point of view, does religion need a theological perspective in itself to accept the legitimacy of that secularity? Is it natural law? Is it salvation outside of the church or mosque? Or how Catholicism maybe came to that point, or maybe it's being challenged still?
Well, it is definitely being challenged still. So no, I think it's a great question. So to summarize a piece of it, does religion, do religious traditions need some kind of conceptual scheme in which to approach secularity and the possibility of pluralism? Absolutely. And so I certainly can't speak globally to this, but in Catholicism, this is a major part of what Vatican II has both uncovered and also developed within the tradition of the church to give us a way to talk about both ecumenical and interreligious realities that isn't only asserting the truth of Catholicism as over against some other competing truth. And this is still contested. You know, the reception of this within the life of the church is contested, and certainly how effective it is contested by dialogue partners outside the Catholic tradition as well. But there's massive intellectual effort needed to undergird that. What I would add to that is there's also a lot of practical and pastoral effort to actually make that a lived reality in the church and not just a set of documents and paragraph numbers we can cite when necessary.
I think we had a question from Jan Werner over there.
Actually, two, if I may. One very specific one for Mark Oppenheimer.
Yeah.
I couldn't help picking up on the point that you made when you said, I used to believe that Trump was a major danger for democracy in the media, and now I believe that to some extent.
Yeah.
I'm just curious what changed
Oh,
and why.
well,
And the second, more broader question for everybody, if I may, is that, I mean, there was a lot that seemed to be a little bit like, if you permit that scandalously Rawlsian language, sort of people who share comprehensive doctrines writing for other people who share comprehensive doctrines. But another question is whether journalists shouldn't be in the business of translating religious concepts and experiences for wider audiences. So I wonder whether any of you have any thoughts on that.
I'll take the one aimed at me. I think that some of my initial hysteria was just reality tested against 4 years of his incompetence. Certainly I think that he is contemptuous of the media. Lots of people are contemptuous of the media, and he all of a sudden had a lot of power, and I think I had fantastic notions about what, ways that he might come for the media, which is extremely free in the United States, freer than it is in the United Kingdom, freer than it is in many countries. We are more protected. Our history of libel and slander law is more media friendly. Judges can change that. Interpretations can change that. The ways that laws are enforced can change that. There are mechanisms that a highly effectual politician who hated journalists could use to make life more difficult for us than it turned out he was interested in doing, competent to do, or just had the attention span to do. So I was really making a fairly small bore point that it was reality tested.
And then to the second, Jan Werner's question.
Let me very briefly say that certainly, I would agree that journalists have a responsibility to translate these comprehensive commitments to other people who don't share them. But the two caveats I would put on that, it remains a translation, right? Which is something we understand when we translate language to language. It remains a translation. You do not thereby have the experience that a native speaker has of hearing the poetry. And the second thing I would add to that is that I also think we need a certain amount of just basic skepticism about whether or not the Rawlsian original position actually works. And I would say, speaking as a believer, it is not descriptive of my experience of believing. To think that this is a position that I can abstract away sufficiently to think about myself as not having it in order to enter into a social contract. Rawls is useful in a whole bunch of ways, but it's not a metaphysical reality, the original position, and I think often it gets assumed that way in public narrative.
So I just have something very quick to say about that. So the job I did at the Times for 6 years, I wrote a column that had been originated by Peter Steinfels, who's a believing Catholic, was continued by Gustav Niebuhr never wrote beliefs. It was Steinfels' column. And the original conception of it was, it's not the regular religion beat, it's somebody who writes every week or every 2 weeks and gets into how is the religion being practiced? And this would be the space where, among other things, you could take on issues of theology. Vatican II gets handed down. How does that change the experience of the Mass for the average Catholic? It was a great column to write. I took it in lots of different places. It doesn't exist anymore. Who's going to write this? I mean, the print media has lost more than half its jobs in 20 years. There is sure, it would be great if we had competent, among other things we should do about sports, religion, finance, whatever it is, have a kind of explainer journalism, hopefully written by thoughtful people who are aware of their own limitations and so on. There is no budget for that. There are about 12 newspapers in the country that still have somebody whose job it is to cover religion. Yeah. I made that number up, but I bet it's about 12. So, I mean, this is, yes, in a world in which you all paid for a daily newspaper and therefore we still had an industry, that would be a reality. And the truth is probably a fifth of you pay for a daily newspaper, if that. It's not something people want to pay for. It's not, and local journalism, I mean, if you pay, it's probably for the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or the Washington Post. But a local paper that could pay someone to talk about the experience of Mass or Shabbat at a local house of worship does not exist. There's no budget for that in the American consumerist appetite.
I just want to say I loved when you did that column for the New York Times.
Oh, thank you.
I always enjoyed reading
Thank
it. And Ruth Graham, Elizabeth Diaz, I mean, we can name probably on one hand
Who does this?
the people who are doing that today. When you asked your question, I was thinking of the first time Mitt Romney ran for president, and the Church of Latter-day Saints was trying to school reporters on what they believed. And, you know, at the end of the day, you really have to have like a real appreciation or experience, or no Latter-day Saint communications office is going to teach you how to write about the Mormons, you know.
All right, we have 1 or 2 minutes so one last question.
Hi, this is for the gentleman from Middlebury College. One of the things that you left us with in your presentation was this idea that part of fixing this problem with the perception around Muslims, especially in this country, is that the media writ large can actually play a role in readdressing, reevaluating its own coverage. I wonder what then you would say to the idea that many of those same folks who, let's say, had a prolific role in either encouraging or sustaining the invasion of Iraq in particular, are still, let's say, very prominent at those papers like the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Atlantic, and what it would take for them to either redress what they've done or been involved in, or replace that kind of opinionated top-down role. What does it look like for the media to evaluate itself under, you know, your review?
Yeah, thanks for the question. And I think this gets back to Mark's comment about what would an army of tone checkers look like, right? And as he said it, in
What
that
would
way,
their
I was
uniform
yeah,
look
I'm-
like? What would they wear?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure I want an army of tone checkers, but I do think that, and this also ties back to the question of objectivity to some degree, right? I mean, our measures are objective. They may not be valid for everybody, right? By valid, I mean they may not get perfectly at a truth that we all agree on out there, but they give us some information that we didn't have before. And so for me, I think, you know, what would be interesting would be to say, what are the different, you know, ways that we can assess how different media outlets are covering different kinds of stories, different groups, different regions, different topics, and are there some measures that can form the basis for a conversation, right? I certainly wouldn't want, you know, imagine that I'm a consultant and I parachute in and I say, you're doing it all wrong, you're fired, right? Who wants that? I don't even want that. But I think saying, here's a report on how you've covered this topic over the last 20 years, now reflect on it, right? That's the sort of internal structure of each individual media outlet will determine the path that takes. But there are ways to get audits done of certain types of coverage. And I think that's something that you know, should be baked in a little bit more to how the media sees itself and what it does to try to self-correct.
I just want to say, as someone who was I was editor of our website 20 years ago, and I published pretty prominent pieces by George Weigel and Michael Novak saying that John Paul II was, you know, a nice guy, but he was wrong about not invading Iraq. I was wrong. And, you know, some of the self-correction is just being authentic, right? And saying that publicly, which I have, and we've tried to, I mean, I speak for myself. Not everybody's on the same page. And one of the things that I do now is I write a lot about the Christians in Iraq whose situation was worse because of the invasion of Iraq. I think, you know, we live and learn, and it's important for journalism to do that too, and opinion journalism.
I think with that, we're at time, so let's give one more round of applause to all 4 of our panelists. Thank you for a great discussion. And more to come in just a few minutes. So we're taking a break until 10:30, 10:35.
great. Thank you. And I really.